Yeah, I really appreciate it, and Tony's glad too. He said, well, it might just
Maybe
be
just
you.
a fourth of your head.
Of course not, but anyway, we're really glad that you came, and it's hard to believe that it's been 3 years since Notre Dame, but Tony's gonna get us all up to date on that. We have one more, let's see, we have 2 more programs this season, which is a late season already, but next Thursday, it's Randy Samuelson Brown. She's been here before, and she's going to talk about the bad old days in Colorado. And she's really a really interesting lady about, the prostitution and all the fun old bad stuff in Colorado. So she's done a lot of research on that. So she's coming back to town to talk about that. So that'll be next Thursday at 2 o'clock, just like this. And next Wednesday at 2 o'clock, Bob Hettenhausen, you guys know Bob Hettenhausen? He's worked with Sandy on some of the programs that she's done. And he's going to show Field of Dreams. And then in a few weeks, then we'll discuss the book Shoeless Joe that goes along with Field of Dreams. So I know you guys probably all saw Field of Dreams, like I did too a long time ago, but it's a really good, it's a good movie. It's a classic. It's good to see it again. So if you can come out next Wednesday and Thursday, that's it for a while.
For a little while.
For a little while.
Yeah.
But we'll have some surprises this summer, I'm sure. But anyway, thanks for coming today, and I'll let Tony tell us what he's going to do. Okay. And please have a cookie on your way out.
There's cookies this time.
Hey.
Right.
The bonus round.
Yeah. So thank you everybody for coming. I've been really looking forward to this. I was going to give this talk 2 years ago as like a 1 year later update, but then things happened. So now it's a 3-year update. I wouldn't have had much to say 2 years ago anyway, so we'll get into that. As a complete sidebar, not related to Notre Dame, but related to buildings with problems, our library is having some electrical trouble brought on by the wind. We've had electricians out here today. They've isolated it to the San Isabel side of the supply, and San Isabel's been contacted. But that's unfortunately why the elevator isn't working. It worked for me once, but we nearly lost 3 of our best community members here 5 minutes ago. Yeah, so you guys got out. But anyway, so I do apologize for that.
Dorothy's all excited that we're going to be stuck in there. Oh, we're going to get stuck. This was great.
We did just have it tested, and the button that you press to call will actually call Huerfano County Dispatch. So it does work. That wasn't working a little while ago, but now it does.
Have you sent Keanu Reeves to rescue us from the trapped elevator?
Yep.
Can we arrange that?
Yeah, we can do that. Absolutely. Now everybody's going to go to the elevator, but anyway. So back to other buildings with problems. So Notre Dame. So does anybody remember the exact date of the fire?
April something.
April something. Yep.
19th?
It was Tony Masinton the First's birthday.
Wow. Oh, it was. Oh.
It's also tax day.
15th.
April 15th. That's right. So April 15th, 2019. I was driving back from the bank in Walsenburg, and I had NPR on, and there was the cathedral's burning, and then everybody told me the cathedral's burning because they know my interest in cathedrals. So I put the doctor and my full name up there because other than like bills where people want money, I never get to use that. So I decided, since I'm talking about my specialism, I'll put my full up there. So I'm Dr. Anthony Masinton, buildings archaeologist. You can call me Tony. I'm the library director here at LVPL. So,
Hey Tony, just tell us a bit about your expertise.
Right, yeah, so I will get a little bit about that, but so my specialism is medieval churches. So this is definitely my specialism, and I did my PhD in medieval English churches, but they're all one stone stacked on top of another, so they're all the same anyway. And so I'm the archaeologist of it in that I don't wait for a building to fall down before I try to figure out what people were doing there and how it looked in the past. I go to buildings that are still standing. I go to ruins too, but and then you try to figure out how they lived and worked in the past, and that tells you interesting things about what people in the past thought. So any building that's been built will have archaeology, as in like changes into it. Even brand new buildings, they'll have changes that are made on the fly while they're building, and that's not random. It's because there's reasons behind it. Sometimes it's supply chain issues, sometimes it's money issues, sometimes it is just people cutting corners. but lots of times it's full of meaning. So if you walk down the alleyway behind Charlie's, look at the backs of all the buildings as you're going down, the stone buildings on the east side, and you'll see that there were doors, and now they're not doors, and there's windows, and now they're doors, and there's windows, and now they're not windows anymore. People have changed these, and that's because they needed to change the use of the interior space. It was built for one purpose, it has changed. And so you can start teasing that out, and you can realize there's archaeology everywhere. So it's a fun thing to do. Timber building, mud building, brick building, stone, doesn't matter. But I have a special interest in medieval churches. So I was fascinated when Notre Dame burned, because it was a tragedy, but I also know it's this great opportunity to learn more about a great building. 3 years ago, I came up here and made the controversial statement that I don't think the Cathedral of Notre Dame is actually a particularly special cathedral from an architectural historical point of view. I still stick with that. I think it's a great, all medieval, it's fine, you can boost, you can have your own opinions, it's fine. All medieval cathedrals are special buildings, first of all. I believe that very firmly, but I think all cathedrals are special buildings, but medieval ones are close to my heart. This is one of the great ones. It doesn't, to me, it doesn't add a lot to, it was part of the technological advancement of the building trades, but it wasn't like a groundbreaker like Durham Cathedral, or Beauvais, or Reims. It wasn't like those cathedrals. It was kind of, it knew where, they knew how to build it, and they built it, and they didn't cut a lot of corners, and it was built mostly all at one time, so it's not that interesting to me, because it's not multiple
The only person I
phases.
know who has cathedral snobbery.
Oh yeah, well, I know a lot of cathedral snobs, but that's an occupational hazard.
What about the flying buttresses? They're unusual. No?
Showed this before Notre Dame.
Yeah, so flying buttresses, and you can make there's some arguments that the flying buttresses actually first get employed at Durham Cathedral, it's just they're under the roof lines. I don't think that theory holds water. I think we're looking at something like Saint-Denis, which is just around the corner from here. Saint-Denis is the first Gothic building in Europe or in the world, built 1140, rebuilt 1140. That's got flyers on it. When I was doing research for this talk, there is an argument to be made that the flyers are additions, later designs, in fact, which is one of the interesting things coming out of the work here. Again, I don't quite believe that, but.
Well, I think they were added later, once they discovered, because wasn't it starting to move because of where it's located?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, on the banks.
Yeah.
It's built on mud.
Right.
So it's going to compact, and you're going to have differential settling, and so it's going to start doing this, and it's also going to. It's tall. It's 100 feet tall in the interior. French churches are really tall and short. English churches are really short and long. So you don't see a lot of flyers on English churches because they don't need it. Also, a lot of English churches have wooden vaults. We'll talk about that. French churches almost always have stone vaults, and stone vaults put a lot of outward thrust on the building, and so the tops of your walls start to do this. And when you're a medieval builder, you notice your walls doing this, you just patch it up with a buttress. So anyway, and the buttresses changed over time here too. We won't get into any of that, unless you want to. So anyway, we'll talk about the fire. So how bad was the damage? 3 years ago, we didn't know the extent of the damage. I think I gave this talk like a week or two after the fire, and I made some predictions about the damage. So I was watching the fire progress happen. So there's an aerial view of the fire.
Oh my God.
I'll move out of your way there. So that's an aerial, that's a police drone view of the fire in progress, which would have been dangerous to fly because of the updraft from all the fire. So there it is, and it's going, the spire's already collapsed at this point, the whole roof is gone, and it's really tragic. I'm very sad for the loss of the roof, because it was an almost completely intact mid-13th century timber roof, and those are very special. So I was really sad to lose the carpentry, because the carpentry is just spectacular, and I love medieval roof spaces better than the ground floors. I always like going into the space between the vaults and the lead roofs, because that's where the real magic kind of happens in these buildings, and it was all gone. So that's sad. But when I was watching it, let's see if I can get the laser pointer to work. When I was watching it, watching the fire burn, I was concerned because this is nighttime. And I thought that, do you see what we're not seeing here?
Yeah.
One thing we're not seeing is there's a rose window here,
Yeah.
and there's another rose here. This is one of the big roses. This is a little rose in the gables. This is one of the big 13th century stained glass roses. And there's giant stained glass windows all the way through here. I would have been worried if we started to see light come through there.
Oh.
Because that would mean that the vaults had broken and the fire was spreading inside. That would have been far more disastrous. But I thought when I was watching it go, I thought, as long as those vaults hold, the fire is going to take out the roof, but it may not take out the rest of the building. And largely that's what happened. So we now know that the big old spire in the middle collapsed, and we all know that iconic footage. And it's shocking, it's heartbreaking. I mean, I make jokes about this cathedral, but it is heartbreaking. The spire collapsed, and the weight of all the timber and the lead, because it was a massive timber spire covered with lead, that just plunged straight through the central vaults and went right down onto the floor. And then we also lost a bit of the vaults right here, and we lost a bit of the vaults right here. And I don't actually know why we lost those two bits of vault, but they collapsed. But the fire kind of didn't really spread too much. Also, the fire got into the, no, sorry, it was a bit of the vaults here, where there's that black space. That's the vaults we lost. And then right over here, pardon me, that's the east end. These are the towers. You can just see them. These are the big towers with the bells, and the north tower, which is just out of shot right here. That caught on fire a little bit too, but it didn't do significant damage.
And Tony, what started the fire again?
Nobody knows yet.
Still.
Yeah, they've gone into an investigation. Was it an electric? So you can see that Notre Dame was going through a big renovation, and they had built this huge scaffolding, which is made of 40,000 separate pipes. This huge scaffold around the spire, and they had finished everything else, and they were just doing the spire, and then the fire started. And did it start because of an electrical fault? So speaking of buildings with electrical problems, did it start because of an electrical fault? Did it start because a workman left a cigarette burning? Did it start for some other natural reason? There was an investigation, and it didn't really come about as being conclusive.
Okay, so did they figure out where the point of origin was?
I don't know.
Okay.
I haven't heard necessarily to figure out even where it started.
You need to get one of the guys from Chicago Fire in there.
Yeah, yeah. He'll have it done in 48 minutes, won't he? Yeah.
Yeah, right, yeah, exactly.
Commercial breaks and everything.
Yeah, right, on the dot.
Yeah.
So 2 questions.
Uh-huh.
One is, what are the history of fires in the building? Have there been other significant fires?
There have been a few other fires, yeah.
And then the second question is, can you clarify exactly what you mean by vaults?
Yeah, thank you. I was going to do that and then I got ahead of myself. So let's just clarify what we mean by vaults. I've got a picture of it later on. So this building had this beautiful lead roof, really steeply pitched, really gorgeous. You might want to try the other one, Mitzi.
Which one do you want?
We can open the back door
No.
Know if
too.
it's working?
I guess not.
That's it. Yep, it's going right there, Mitzi,
Oh, is it?
behind you.
Is that good?
It's just
Is that
starting
good?
up, yeah.
Thank you.
That might cause the disco thing to go on downstairs, but that's okay. So the building used to have this big lead roof, steeply pitched. The lead roof was held up by this amazing framework of huge oak timbers, rafters, and then immediately under that is the stone vaults, which the ceilings are all stone. So if you go in on the ground floor and look up, you get that amazing arched heavens kind of expanse, and that's all stonework, and those are called the vaults. And so the vaults run below the tops of the walls, and then the rafters of the roof sit on the tops of the walls. So you actually have a huge space between the roof ridge and the tops of the vaults. And then underneath there's a 100-foot drop down to the floor.
And even with their stone, some of the vaults were lost?
Yes, so the vaults are built in sections. Cathedrals are built in sections that are called bays, and it kind of goes identical piece by identical piece mainly. And then the vaults vault each bay. These are called quadripartite vaults, which means that if you look at them on plan, they're made out of 4 sections. where you take a tube this way and half a tube this way, and where they cross, it makes 4 sections. So those are called quadripartite. I think these are quadripartite. Now I'm looking at it. We'll look again. They may be sexpartite, which means they have 6. They join 2 bays and it turns a quad into a sexpartite. But anyway, but they're thick stone. I mean, we'll see with a human standing there. They're maybe thinner than you might think, but they're that thick to maybe, so what, 3 to 5 feet thick?
Wow.
Yeah, they're pretty impressive. But they broke because they're like an eggshell. And when that spire went through, it couldn't withstand all of that force, and it just
Did
lost
the
crossing.
lead roof then melt?
Yeah, so the lead roof did 2 things.
And it should have run.
It melted and ran off, but it also just burned. They estimate
Ooh, toxic.
several tons of lead vaporized and went into the air over Paris.
Oh.
And they have been, the French government has been doing regular lead checks all over the city. And they've discovered that some places closer to the cathedral are lead contaminated. Not to the point of where you have to be particularly worried, but there's still a higher presence of lead closer to the cathedral.
Probably also got into the water source.
Yeah, they've been testing all the water and all that kind of stuff and seeing, yeah. So, yeah, it was an environmental disaster as well. Yeah. So, this is the aftermath.
Yeah.
A slightly different view from before, but it's a drone shot. So we can see all these black places are not holes in the vaulting. All these black places are ash from the timber. So this is all that's left of that beautiful 13th century set of timbers. This is a big hole in the scaffolding. So the scaffolding didn't really burn, it just kind of melted. And that hole goes all the way down 100 feet to the floor. This is the north, so a cathedral looks like a cross, this long bit here, and then this short bit across here, and the arms of the cross are called transepts, and it just means things that cross. And then the middle where they meet is called the crossing. And no matter which way a cathedral actually points, this end of the cathedral, the round end in France and in England, they're all square, almost all of them are square, but the end where the high altar is always called the east end, and the set with the main doors opposite that's always called west, and then you have north and you have south. So when I'm talking about east, west, north, south, here it is east, west, north, south, but every cathedral is called, it doesn't matter which way they're orientated. So it's called liturgical east.
It has nothing to do with the real direction?
No.
No,
No.
it's just that most of them are orientated generally east, the vast majority, but there are some significant ones that are south or west even. German, there's a few classic Romanesque German cathedrals that are called double enders, where they have this rounded end is called an apse, and they have an apse on the east and the west end, and altars in both. But still, in a German cathedral, the main high altar is always the east end, no matter where it's pointing, and the other one's
Because
always the
that
west.
is north, right?
In this case,
Roughly.
in case this is actually east, that's actually west. So it is because the sen here kind of goes east-west at this point. So anyway, but when I'm talking about east-west, it's
Got it.
liturgical.
Okay, thank you.
But anyway, so we can see here on the north transept, this is the north crossing arm of the church. We can see there's one of the holes in the vaults. If it had gone this much further over, we would have lost the stained glass window. And then we had a hole right here, which you can't really see, and then there's this big crossing hole, again, which is hidden by the scaffolding. But anyway, a real shame. So it was lost.
Yeah.
This building, sorry.
It's kind of like a metronome.
Yeah, we may open the door. So this is the rubble from the collapsed spire and the burned timbers, and you're looking across from you're standing west, and you're looking east to the high altar. This is kind of the statuary around the high altar. There's lots of altars in a church, medieval church particularly, but the main altar, the kind of principal altar, is called the high altar. It is also literally higher than the others. It's up on more steps. But anyway, yeah, we might want to just turn that off, Mitzi, and open the back porch door.
Did you want me to turn it off?
Yeah, go ahead and turn it
Yeah.
off. Yeah, and then we'll open that back porch door. So anyway, yeah, so this is so this hasn't crashed onto the high altar. It looks like it because of the perspective. Hi, Jim.
Hello.
But this is the stuff in the crossing. So this is the timber, these are some of the pipes from the scaffolding. This is the stonework of the vaults. And like this one's been carved round. This one's got a kind of carving bit to it. So the vaults were held up. So you imagine again a half pipe and a half pipe going this way. And when they cross, it makes an X. And then the places where they cross are called the groins. And then along those groins or those ridges, there's an arch, a bit of special arch masonry. That's called a rib. And so that's a rib that collapsed. That's probably part of a rib right there. That's a rib for sure. So you can see how it kind of fell in, which is really interesting. I would love to have surveyed this pile of junk, because I'm really fascinated with how buildings collapse.
Did
This
they?
would have been really good. Yes, they did. So once this burned, this was declared a National Archaeological Site, which meant that the archaeologists went in. They didn't go in first, we'll get to that, but they did come in here.
Is that statue on the right, is that half of it at the top half, has it been knocked off?
No, I don't think so, because they said, the Friends of Notre Dame Cathedral said that the high altar artwork and statuary was saved. It was not destroyed. So this is a person kneeling.
It's kneeling.
Oh,
It's
okay,
kneeling
the
like
head,
that, yeah.
Okay.
But again,
Because I was looking at the one on the left and.
Google anything I'm saying. Google what the cause of the fire was, just to double check me on, do they know where it started at least? Double check me on that. And double check me on, did this statue get destroyed? It really, like we lost some canopies here. We lost some pieces of canopies here because there's choir stalls where the main clergy would sing every service, and they would sit in these, they're called stalls, and they would face each other, and then the altar would be right here. And they'd face each other and they'd sing in polyphonic music. And those were 17th century, I think, in this cathedral, and I think we lost those. And we definitely lost some of this. This looks 18th century, but anyway, I think we lost some of that. They were wood.
But you didn't lose the Veta.
No, very little art was lost. The immovable art had to fend for itself, very little of it was lost. The movable art was out. They have special fire and rescue trained people to rescue art and relics from historic sites. And this is a special trained team, and in Paris they called them out, and they did it, and one of the art rescuers, and she's an art historian and conservator, she said that she remembered, and I can't remember her name, I apologize, but she remembered kind of fleeing from the cathedral after they rushed in to get some of the things. And she had on her lap the shroud of Saint. It was either Mary, the Virgin Mary, or it was John. One of those two. And then her boss was sitting next to her in the van, and he had the crown of thorns on his lap.
Oh my gosh. You're right.
So
Yeah, right.
Yeah, right.
the French version. Yeah, it's fine. Please express skepticism. People in the Middle Ages. So when the crown of thorns came to France first, in Saint Louis himself, the King of France brought them from Byzantium and the Holy Land. He housed them in the Sainte-Chapelle, which is just across the river, which is his special chapel, which still stands and is the most glorious space almost in the universe. And they were housed there. The whole building was built as a special reliquary jewel to hold the crown of thorns. And then I think in the Revolution they made their way over to the cathedral. But anyway, yeah. So, but they had these things, and then lots of other bits of movable art and relics. They got out of there, so actually very little of that was lost. So that's really good. Again, a testament to the protective work of the vaults of the cathedral, and where they did fail, they failed in places where there wasn't much under them, which is the everyday working altar of the cathedral was in the crossing. Is a very modern altar because that's a change in Catholic tradition post World War II to stick your high altar, your working altar in the middle of the cathedral, and that gone. But anyway. Let's see, next one. Some more fire damage. This is in the north tower, the northwest tower. This is one of the bells, just to show you that's fire damage.
Wow.
But none of the bells were lost or damaged. Should be really good because this framework is all wood. Most bell frameworks inside medieval towers are wood. And if that would have burned, those bells would have come down and they would have brought a bunch of the tower with them. Yeah, like the end of that movie Face Off. You know that classic of architecture. You know, Nicolas Cage and John Travolta, Face Off. They end that one with bringing a bell down in it. Yeah, it's an accurate depiction.
Yeah.
So here's the vaults.
Tony, where did you get these photos?
Okay, I do need to say this for the record as well. None of these photos are mine because I was there in November of 2018 and then in April 2019 it burned. That was the last time I was there. These are all just sourced, most of them are Creative Commons from Flickr website. Creative Commons means they're open for use. I need to cite them, and I can cite them if you're interested, but you wouldn't be able to read the citations that are here, and I'm not going to post this slideshow on the internet, so this is coming under sort of fair use and educational purposes, but I do have the copyright information if you're interested. This comes from a research paper that was done into how hot the beams actually got. So that's why it says A and B, it's from that paper. But this is the crossing of the building. You can see where the vaults are just gone. These are the ribs. They were just completely wiped out. They would have crossed right here. This is your next bit in the nave. The nave of the church is the long western arm of the church. And you can see where we lost, these are sexpartite vaults, pardon me. See, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we lost half of one of those as well. And then this is the one right over the north rose window. But this little bay and this little vault, totally saved it. So yeah, if this would have come, and so there's so that's that window we were just looking at right there. And one thing you can't see here, but you can see better there, is that there's the gable end. So your house, if you have a house with a roof, the ends of the house, if you were to take the roof off, the end of the house would just be this freestanding triangle of wood here or stone. This is a very thin freestanding triangle of stone, and if that had got pulled over, the whole facade would have gone down. That usually doesn't happen. They stand pretty well when a building like this is destroyed. See if I can get to the next one. So, what we need to review, so that was the destruction. We lost the 13th century roof, we lost the spire, which, does anybody remember how old that spire is?
Not too old.
Yeah, correct. That spire is 19th century. It's from 1859. So there was a spire in the Middle Ages going all the way up to the beginning of the 18th century. There was a spire that looked very similar to the one that we see. It was a little smaller, a little shorter. It was medieval. And then it was taken down after the Revolution, or maybe just before the Revolution it was taken down. The cathedral was in terrible shape by that time, and they just took the spire off. And then
To correct it or make it better?
I think just because nobody wanted to maintain it anymore, and they knew that if it collapsed, it'd take the building, and so they're just like, let's get rid of this. And the guy who put it back up is this fellow. Anybody know who he is?
Eiffel.
Mr.
No, but he did work with Eiffel. This guy was the chief engineer on the Statue of Liberty project. Not Eiffel, this was the engineer. This is Eugène Viollet-le-Duc. Yeah, so it's spelled like Violet Leduc, but Viollet-le-Duc. And he's the reason the castles at Disneyland look like the castles at Disneyland. They're basically straight out of a Viollet-le-Duc pattern book from the mid-19th century. He's the reason why, he's the reason why the Catholic Cathedral in Denver, right next to the Capitol building, looks the way it does. They're taking it from his pattern books. He basically was responsible in France for elevating the status of Gothic architecture, because in the 19th centuries, particularly the 18th and 17th centuries, Roman architecture, Roman and Greek architecture, classical architecture, which is pillar, lintel, pointy bit, right? Just called a pediment. But so pillar, lintel, pediment, it's called trabeated architecture. That was considered the most enlightened. That carried with it, it had very well defined orders of architecture: Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, right? Tuscan if you want to go weird, composite if you want to go really fancy. But, and they all kind of meant something, right? So if you have a Doric pediment, has very little decoration on it. It's for like banks and for like military installations, that sort of thing. And if you were going to build a church, it would all be in Corinthian order. And that's much more kind of frilly, like the capitals, the tops of the pillars have lots of leaves poking out of them and stuff like that. And then you do something composite, which is like Ionic and Corinthian together, and then you're just being decadent and debased, so you make like a nightclub out of composite, right? I'm not joking, because in Jane Austen times, so everybody like, what's the name of it? The Bridgerton. Right, Bridgerton, that excellent bit of historical drama, and they're all going to their parties, and they go to like the parties where they all get together in one big room, and then they all dance. They all do a line dance in the room, right? Those rooms are called assembly rooms, and those were all the rage in 18th century and early 19th century Britain. They were all built generally in a composite order. But then in a way that made them be called Egyptian, even though it was Greek. It's complicated. Anyway, but it's all square architecture. And in Leduc's time, the Gothic architecture was considered barbaric, which is the name Gothic comes from the Vasari, who is a 17th, 18th century Italian architectural historian who wanted to say that the native architecture of Italy, which is Roman, is vastly superior to this debased bit of architecture that was brought down from the north by the barbarians after they sacked Rome. And then they created this ridiculous architecture that has gigantic windows and stained glass and frilly bits and pokey things and gargoyles. I hate that. It's utterly ridiculous. It is barbaric. It was made by the Goths, and the Goths are the ones who sacked Rome. And then it just stuck. So that was not the term for this architectural style in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, it had all sorts of crazy names, depending on where you lived. But anyway, Leduc and some guys in England, basically, by going through and carefully drawing and recording in a kind of semi-archaeological way the existing surviving medieval architecture, elevated it. They basically did the thing where they put it in print and they ran a PR campaign, and then it suddenly became, if you were going to build a church in one of your colonies in Africa, then you're going to build it in Gothic style, because that's what's going to bring a sense of spirituality and religion to the people you have colonized. Right? So that's why we get Gothic style churches out west here. Why, like the churches up in Fairplay, the little wooden, like that wooden church that's drawn on the wall right there. There's a church that still exists in Fairplay, or there's a couple of them in Lake City. These little wooden quaint churches of the gingerbread Gothic. That gingerbread Gothic is Gothic because of this fellow. So anyway, it's all related. But he elevated it, and then he kind of worked arm in arm with Victor Hugo, who published Hunchback of Notre Dame, because the cathedral was crumbling and collapsing and he wanted it saved. He published that got the public to be excited in it. Viollet-le-Duc did the drawings and the engineering, and he built the spire. So he rebuilt the spire. And he built it with the 12 apostles in these huge statues going up the edges. And Doubting Thomas is, his face looks a lot like this guy's face.
Who paid for it?
Who paid for it? I think there was a commission. It was done by Napoleon III at government. Again, I was just looking at this today, because I was more interested in what happened to the building and not the Duke. But yeah, check me on that one, but it might have been during the Empire. That's who paid for it. Also, a lot of this stuff was done by public subscription. Yeah, Hugo got a lot of people to donate money to this project earlier. So he started renovating the Notre Dame in the 1840s. The spire gets finished in about 1859. So it's like a couple of different campaigns. He was only, not in this picture, but when he started Notre Dame, he was like 36 or 37. So quite a young buck. So how do cathedrals stand? So this is important to what we're going to talk about, like why it's still taken 3 years and we haven't actually rebuilt anything yet. Despite that Macron wants this to be done, he gave it a 5-year span because it needs to be open by the time the Olympics are held in Paris. And all of it's really fun to watch the documentaries and all the people in charge of the different departments of restoration and rebuilding, and they ask them, you know, and do you think you'll be done by the Olympics? And they all go, well,
We are French,
we
so.
will have, yeah, we'll have
Sure.
something. Yeah, because you know, anyway. So this is just a quick illustration of how these buildings stand up. So stone architecture works pretty much exclusively in compression, which means it's just one block of stone stacked on another. If you see that, the side of the mercantile out the window, That's compression. Everything is just stacked one on top of the other. Now, you can make a bit of stone architecture work in tension, which means that you can kind of hang things off of it, or you can pull it rather than just compress it. You can do that if you add some bits of wood to it, or you add some metal to it. So if you look on the side of the mercantile here, if you can't see it right now, notice next time you're going by, there's a whole row of little metal bits about 15 feet up on the wall there at the Merc. Those are called wall ties, or short wall anchors. They're a Dutch invention. I don't know why I know this. I do know. There was a friend of mine did a PhD on these. Anyway, so these wall anchors are built to provide some tension where it ties the wall together, because these walls are built in two skins. A wall of nicely cut stones, a wall of nicely cut stones, and then a slurry of stone rubble and lime mortar in between. And it kind of glues them together, and these wall anchors glue that together even more. And wherever those wall anchors are, they add an area of more strength that works both in compression as well as a little bit in
Sorry,
tension.
do you mean the same wall, but the inside and outside of the wall?
Yeah,
So,
yeah, but the inside, the walls are made of two skins.
okay.
There's a skin of stone here, a skin of stone here, and then this like compressed slurry of rubble, usually rubble and mortar, but sometimes rubble and mud in the middle. But anyway, so those wall anchors tie them together. Most medieval cathedrals are not known for having very much metal work in the walls, which is probably a good thing, because if you imagine the freeze and thaw cycle, that metal would just break the walls apart. However, we'll find out the fire revealed something very interesting about Notre Dame. But anyway, so they work in compression. So how do you get, so if everything's just stacked on top of each other, how do you get a stone vault? Like an umbrella of stone, where some stones have nothing under them. Yeah, slowly, yeah. Yeah, so, yeah, what you do is you build an arch out of wood, and then you put that in place, and then you cut your stones exactly at the right angles, all the way along that arch of wood, and then you remove the arch of wood, and as the stones fall towards the floor, they all fall at the same time, and they press each other together, and they all hold each other up. And it's actually a really strong, way of building.
Have you ever been there to see it happen?
To build arches?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
that must be something else.
Yeah.
When the Keystone does it?
Yeah, the keys.
Yeah, I mean the keystone, but the thing is, the cool thing about these is that you can knock that keystone out, and the arch will stand. Yeah, it's,
Now, after it's settled, you mean?
you can build it without a keystone. Even when you're building their loose stones, you can build them without a keystone. And if you're just building one arch of one stone, you must have the key. You can't have any stone missing, or the whole thing will collapse. But if you're going to build a vault, which is a web of arches, if you imagine a whole bunch of arches all kind of stacked on top of each other, that's a vault, which is a web of arches. That means that the stones are not just holding up their neighbors to the left and the right, they're also holding up their neighbors either top and bottom, either side. And so you have this web of compression, and it means that you can poke holes in that vault and it'll still stand. You can't drive a lead spire through it and hope that it will stand. But there's a lot of medieval churches that have their crossing is this 100 feet up in the air, and it's this huge like 50-foot span, and you're like, how does the stones hang there? And then you realize there's no keystone at all. There's a big circular well right in the middle of it, and it's perfectly structurally sound because it's
Like the
keeping up.
Pantheon.
Yeah, like the Pantheon. Pantheon's made out of concrete, so it's actually working in tension as well as compression. And you couldn't destroy the Pantheon with a nuclear missile. It's really well built.
Let's not try.
Yeah. It's I mean it's Roman. I mean the Roman concrete was cool.
When concrete.
And they didn't know, and they'd lost the formula for concrete by this time. Which is a good thing, because if they hadn't, then we still would have had boring classical architecture. Instead we got Gothic, which is virtuosity in stone. Jim, did you have a question?
Did you read about a recent paper done where they have been investigating elements in Roman concrete, and they decided that one of the elements they had been missing was blood?
That's interesting. No, I hadn't read that.
That's what they think gave it that strength and durability.
It's like the protein of eggs in a cake, right?
Or wheat starch, wheat paste in adobe.
Yeah, a binder.
Binder.
Yeah. They didn't have concrete here at all. They had lime mortar, which is made out of lime, and we'll talk about why that's both a problem and not. The lime mortar is a bit of a glue. It's really helpful when you're building it. Once it dries, it does another job, but it doesn't do a structural job too much. Like you could pull all the mortar out of these vaults and they would still stand. They get a little bit wonky, yep, but they would still stand because it's all compression at that point. But the lime mortar still does a really important job, which we'll talk about later because this is part of the problem with the building after the fire. But anyway, if you can see, it's really hard to see, but there's little arrows. And that's basically, if you look at flying, this is like why do flying buttresses work? If you imagine gravity being like water, and this water is like a sheet of water pouring out of the sky. What you want to make sure is you want to make that water get down to the ground, following your building, not going through your building. So the angle of the roof here, these are lead roofs with timber. The timber acts in tension in a really great way. It allows you to you can pull and push timber. That's why like all the earthquakes in Japan, most of the really old timber buildings in Japan stay up because they're timber, and so you can shake those buildings, twist and turn them, pick them up, set them down, and they generally settle and then they remain standing because they work in compression as well as tension. You can pull them. Stone doesn't work that way at all. When we lived in England, there was a minor earthquake, and we lived in York, and it has the biggest medieval cathedral north of the Alps. The earthquake happened at like 1 a.m. First thing I did was bolt upright in bed, and did not check on my wife nor my infant daughter, but ran into my daughter's room, past her, to look out the back window where I could see the minster, because I was sure that thing was going to come down. Because stone buildings really hate shaking. So if I had a block-based or stone-based version of Notre Dame here, and I went like that, it'd be done. But if it was made out of popsicle sticks, I could shake this table and it wouldn't fall down. So anyway, so you imagine the pressure, the energy, we'll call it, the pressure of gravity basically pulling down, but running down here. This frame is exerting pressure on the tops of this wall. These are really thin walls and they're pierced with big windows. And so the pressure is pushing the tops of these walls like this. Also, the pressure these are the stone vaults. And the pressure from the stone vaults is also putting pressure down here about a third or a quarter of the way down the tops of the walls. So the tops of the walls are wanting to do this. So they've got that big old roof and they got those vaults pushing them like this. So what do? You put a buttress up against it. You put another wall. So all buttresses are walls that are perpendicular to your main wall. And because medieval builders figured out that really all you want to do is just kind of channel the energy of compression or gravity down to the ground, you don't actually need a wall under it. So they just open that up with a big old arch. So a flying buttress is just a really massive wall with a hole in it. Because all of your energy is just going to transfer down here, and it's going to go straight to the ground. And medieval people had formula, geometric. You didn't have to know what 2 + 2 was to build a cathedral like this, but you had to be a master at geometry. You had to be a practical geometry master. And they had geometric formulae for figuring out how big your buttresses had to be and that sort of stuff, and your flyers. And so what we see is we see 2 layers of flyers here to counteract the what's called lateral thrust. And so that's how they stand up. If you remove any of these elements, you will remove one of the channels for that energy to be channeled into the ground, and you will destabilize your building. So what happens when this burns and this roof comes off? Right? Because this roof is acting in tension as well, which means that even though it's putting a little bit of pressure on the tops here, it's also pulling it together. If you lose your roof, you might be losing a bit of a capstone. So they were really concerned when the fire happened and the roof was gone that maybe these buttresses weren't up to the job on their own, and that might have untied at the top of it, and it might have started doing this. So they were really, really worried. And that's why it took them months to even get tarps up over the top here to protect it from rain, because they were just not sure if you if you just breathed on it, maybe it would collapse. Like it was in such a perilous state. And so they had to go and do a bunch of structural surveys with drones and lasers and photogrammetry and run some tests to try to figure out, is this going to keep standing or is it just going to fall down at any moment? Add to the joy of this, the heavy weight of the stone, add to the joy of this, that.
The water.
Water.
Oh,
Stone is a sponge, right? So even when there's no snow on the peaks, we're still getting water out of them because they're aquifers, because the water is percolated down into the stones, and then it slowly comes out. So they just added, when they were putting out the fire, they literally added tons of water into the structure of the building. Remember what I said about those walls being a skin, and then this it's not loose, but a more porous matrix inside? They filled that up with water. So the walls filled up with water. So now you had additional weight, and it was not distributed evenly. That was a problem. And then because it was open to the rain came in and soaked more. So they loaded this building up with water, and that's a massive problem. And so they had to do something about it. Another problem is this. Has anybody seen this in a stone building? This little white bit coming out of the stones. If you go into the interior of the Mercantile and you look on this south wall about this high off the floor, you'll notice some water staining. If you were to pull the plaster coating back, you would see this. That's water that's been absorbed by the stones because the dirt of the little park out here on the outside is like a foot or two higher than the floor level is. So there's water holding dirt packed up against the wall, the base of the walls of the Mercantile, and the walls of the Mercantile are soaking up water from the grass, and then that water just travels through the stone as evaporation happens. This is how plants get water to go through their vascular systems. It's just evaporation out of the leaves, and it pulls the next bit of water up. Same thing is happening here. Water is migrating from a high water place to a low water place, and it comes to the edge of the stone, and then it evaporates out. The problem is that the stone will be carrying other minerals in it. This is all limestone. It'll be carrying a mixture of other minerals, and then when those minerals get near the surface, and this is the problem, near the surface of the stone, they're salt, and they crystallize, and they make really pretty crystals, but the crystals take up space. And what's going to give? The surface of the stone, and so it pops off. They have estimated that in the interior of the cathedral, because it's all going to the inside, in the underside of those vaults, they've lost up to an inch in the past 3 years.
Wow. Oh my goodness.
From the salts migrating out.
Wow.
So that takes stone that is already weakened because of fire. So how do you make lime? How do you make quicklime? You burn limestone. That's one way you get the lime out of limestone. It's the calcium that makes quicklime quick, that dissolves things. And so limestone burns, and when you heat it, it's going to burn. And these vaults, in some of the places, the vaults turn pink. And when you see a limestone building that has pink limestone in patches, you know there's been a fire in that area. And so some of the vaults are pink, which means, and once the stone goes pink, it's got no structural integrity because it's just friable, it's dust. And then you get water in it, and then you get salts. And the stone just evaporates and melts. So they're really worried about this, so they've got to get the water out of the vaults. And we'll talk about how they're doing that. So what has happened so far? Please, if you need to go, please go at any time. I will not be offended. Because it's 5:03 already.
You could talk till 7 p.m.
I will. That's a problem for all of us. Okay, so what's happened so far? They're having mass back in the church again. Yeah, which is great. Interesting. These fellows don't have respirators on. These guys all have respirators and hazmat suits on. Do you want to know why these guys have respirators and hazmat suits?
Because they're smart.
Because they're smart. Okay, smart fellows.
They're atheists.
They're atheists. That turns this into like a very threatening thing. Like suddenly it's like, go ahead and do your thing, but like we're going to close in on you slowly. No, these guys are going to mass. They're attending mass. This is a little bit misleading, but I just was trying to look for some pictures of guys in respirators. So what happened? To go on site, maybe a little bit less so today, but maybe not. You need to wear a respirator at least, if not a hazmat suit, in much of the building. Not all of it, but back in the beginning, all of it you needed to do. In fact, in the beginning, after the fire, they wouldn't send humans in at all. They sent in little robotic cameras on little tank treads and stuff like you get like with bomb squads. They sent those in to survey the building because it could collapse and also you could die. And why could you die? Because what's covering every square inch of this building after this fire? Lead. Yeah, exactly. Lead dust mixed with soot. And it's gummy because it's been wet. And so they have for the past 3 years, and they're still doing right now, well maybe not right now, it might be quitting time in France. They're 8 hours ahead of us. Yeah, well done. They have a huge army of people who are in there vacuuming the cathedral, and they all wear battery-powered vacuum packs, and they spend all day, every day, vacuuming every millimeter of this cathedral, and they're going to do it 3 times. There's a 3-stage cleaning process, and when they're done, this will be the cleanest old building in the universe, and it will be much brighter because all of the interior will be almost white, because the original limestone, which they just quarried this from, Paris is built in a huge limestone deposit. That's why the catacombs are there. Those catacombs are quarries, and then they got turned into burial grounds later. But they were used to build buildings like Notre Dame and all the other limestone buildings in Paris. But anyway, it's this white limestone, or whitish, mostly white limestone. And when they clean it back, it's going to be brilliant white. That is not the way the original builders built the building. They were not interested in the brilliant white stone. What they did is they then plastered the whole thing over with really beautiful fine white plaster, and then they painted in red lines stone blocks. And then they decorated the stone blocks with like little roses and things, and little symbols, and in some places they made huge paintings. And all of that's gone from the interior of this church because nobody took care of it, and the plaster falls off because water salts, they pop the plaster off. I wouldn't be surprised, again, look this up if you're interested, I wouldn't be surprised if Viollet-le-Duc scraped the whole thing with wire brushes when he did his restoration. Which, by the way, according to medieval law, deconsecrated the building. So, don't tell people if you have a nice old medieval church building and you completely scraped the original plaster off the interior. Don't tell anybody who's very proud of that job because it's expensive, takes a lot of time, but they deconsecrated it. But anyway, that's a bit of law we can talk about. But they'll have scraped this whole building back. So it'll be a beautiful, pristine white that the original builders never intended. Do I think that's a problem? No, I love it. I think it's going to be beautiful, but it is not like some original vision of the building. But anyway, so they have cleaned some areas of the building, and those areas are safer to go with your hazmat, with your respirators off. So basically, they're having mass. I think they may be having daily mass in there now, just to have mass, even if nobody shows up. And my interpretation of this is that you're having mass in a safe, in a cleansed part of the building, and these guys are the workers, and they've showed up just for mass. And they're going to mass and they're going back to work. To get onto the site, to do the work on the site, you go into the little site hut, you walk in on one side, which is the public side of the building. You walk in there on the public side, there's a bank of showers. You undress, you get showered, you get in your hat suit, and you go out a door on the other side. So there's like an airlock almost between the 2 zones. And then to come out, you do the same thing on the way out. It's getting better. They cleaned much more of the building. So not everybody always has to wear this, but you're going to see lots of respirators and hazmat suits. So they're de-leading the building. This is archaeology. These are all the fragments of the roof. See, there's another one of those rib pieces. The individual pieces of an arch is called a voussoir, by the way. So there's a voussoir. Lots of voussoirs and things over here, and pieces of vaults. This is some metalwork and lead from the spire that collapsed. What's really interesting is when the spire collapsed, the very tip of it survived, lodged on the top of the broken central vault, and it has all these like lead rosettes on it and things still. It's interesting. I don't have a picture of that, I'm sorry. But anyway, this is an archaeologist, and he's at this is a temporary site, so it looks like it might be on site. And they have been looking at every fragment of wood and metal and stone to come out of the building for an archaeological research project, but also because it has been decreed that when they rebuild the building, all the rebuilding must be done using the same techniques and materials as they did originally. That's expensive, but they got $1 billion donated to them, right? Like literally $1 billion. So they have money to spare. Not really, $1 billion. Oh yeah, they're going to put it all covered with lead again. Yep, and it's all going to be built out of oak again, and the limestone. Yeah.
And are they doing any fire prevention or protection?
I assume there'll be a lot of fire prevention stuff in there. Yeah, they'll probably most medieval cathedrals and roof spaces that I've been into have not maybe every bay, but every few bays they actually have a fire wall built up so that if a fire it's like the Titanic in water, the idea, which didn't work in the Titanic, but if one chamber burns, they might be able to get it out before it spreads to the next chamber. You know, they have like a series of things they can retreat back. I would assume they would do that. They talked about doing this at Notre Dame, and they just said no. From an architectural purism point of view, it just destroys the whole feeling of being up there in the rafters, which was called the forest. It destroys the whole point of the forest. We will never put fire breaks up there.
Do you know if they're doing any earthquake retrofitting?
I don't think they probably will be. I don't think you could retrofit the whole building anyway. And earthquakes are really, really rare here. I mean, they were really rare in England where I lived and we still had one. And the cathedral did not fall down. But another church I studied, its spire did come down. But anyway, so the archaeologists are doing their work. They've discovered some interesting things. Maybe not as many as I would like, but they did. These guys came in. These were some of the first fellows to come in. These are the rope, what do they call them? Rope access technicians, or RATs. The RATs came in, and these guys are like your hotshot fire jumpers. These are your amazing guys and gals, and they just use climbing equipment. This guy's suspended above the crossing, and it's a hole straight down like 120, 150 feet straight to the floor. And they're just on their ropes, and they have reciprocating saws, and they have buckets, and they go down and they trim off all of the really unstable burned parts of the scaffolding. It took them 2 years to get that burned scaffolding out of there. Because if you did it, it's a massive pickup sticks, and if you do it wrong, the scaffolding goes in and it brings the rest of the building with it, because it's right. So you have to do this really carefully, a bit at a time. They got all the really dangerous stuff off. They pared it back till it was really stable, and then they cut the whole scaffold apart in 4 sections, and then with cranes outside they lifted those sections off and put them down, and the scaffold is gone. The scaffolding they got off in November of last year. It's been 6 months.
What was the scaffolding made
The
of?
scaffolding made of is just steel pipes,
Steel?
galvanized, I think. Yeah, pipes.
When was that put in?
2018,
The scaffolding?
the scaffold was.
Wow, so that was only in for half
A year, half a year, yeah.
Wow.
Because it was the last part of this big restoration project they were doing. They're like, we will finish with the spire, it will be the glory of France.
And what was the purpose of installing the scaffolding then?
Because they were doing restoration on the lead and timber of the spire.
Oh, got it, okay.
Yeah, yeah,
The scaffolding had not been there at the time of the fire.
it was there at the time of the
I know,
fire.
but had it not been there, more of the building would have been lost, is that what you're saying? 'Cause it was
No. I don't think the scaffolding is holding the building together at all.
Oh.
The scaffolding is
In the way.
in the way, so it was like so they built the scaffolding so it doesn't touch the building. But if it were to collapse inward, it might pull those wall tops in, and there's nothing to counteract it because the crossing bolts are gone. So they had to be really delicate about it, and it took them a long time, like I said, 2 years, over 2 years to get this down. So they just did in November, so and the rats were part of it. And then one thing they did very quickly is they basically reverse built the cathedral. And when they were building these flying buttresses, and they were building the cathedral back in the 14th century, maybe for these buttresses, maybe 13th, I don't know. This is the big debate. This is what it would have looked like while they were building it. They built these massive timber supports. They set it up, and then they build their stonework along it. So basically, most of the stonework in the cathedral right now, because these supports are still there, most of the stonework in the cathedral is not doing any structural work. Most of the weight is now being taken by these that they put in. And every single one of these has to be made unique. So they had to do like a laser scan and a very precise survey of every single one of these, and then very precisely build these timber forms for every one of them. Because this building's been standing for 800 years, stuff moves. And you can't shove in something that's too big or too small.
How many buttresses are there?
I do not know. We should count them. I can't even remember how many bays long it is.
One,
2 per bay.
2, wait, 1, 2.
Yeah, exactly, because they're all the same.
Yeah.
Because I think it's like 8 bays, maybe in the choir, which is the eastern arm, and so each one will have 2, so that's 16, and then how many bits in the radiating chapels along the side? I don't know, I wouldn't be surprised if we had 30, 40 along here. They did this inside and out, so all the vaults, the ribs for each crossing ridge of the vaults, they all have this in them now. Inside. And the cathedral has the central aisle, and a pair of aisles, and a pair of aisles. It's a 5-aisle wide cathedral, and they all are vaulted. And so most of that now has these supports. So that basically they're helping it. They're helping it take the weight off, because they're concerned that while they're doing all of this work, they could bring it down. Because it's still drying out. So there's another example of it. And all of this up here, this is so the scaffold's gone now. Once the scaffold's gone, they installed a sliding roof. So it's kind of a tarp roof. It's got a steel or aluminum framework, and then it's got this big sliding bay over the central part that they can move back when they need to, and then they can move it forward to make it watertight again. And why would you do that? Because when the spire crashed through the central vaults, it became like super convenient. Because now when you want to bring anything into the cathedral, you don't have to lift it up and over. You just bring it in and go right down the center in the hole and pull it out. So, yeah, that's silver linings. Yeah. So scaffolding went. I just thought this was a really fascinating picture. There's a rat. This is the scaffold. This was a net to pick up the debris that they kind of dropped as they were sawing. And then this is the crossing. You're seeing the transepts in the western end of the church. Pretty impressive. And I just was impressed with the rats. So here they are again. Here they're working, and then we have some other workers. They have filled the entire interior now with scaffolding, and it's this huge forest of scaffolding on the inside. It's really beautiful, actually. I'm impressed. But this is showing. So this is a rib of the vault. That's the vault, the stones of the vault themselves. So they're only like this thick. That's the stones of the vault. The bit in between is called the web. And then on top of it is a really thick layer of plaster. That plaster was put up there by Viollet-le-Duc as fire control. And they thought that if there was a fire in the ceiling, the roof would collapse onto the backs of the vaults. But they figured the vaults could take it if the vaults didn't get overheated. And so they put this thick layer of really thick layer of plaster on top of the vaults, because the plaster will absorb the heat a little bit better than the stone will. And so it's this sacrificial layer of plaster, and it worked.
Wow. Yay.
Yay, it worked. And then when they covered the building with water and it rained, the water percolated through the plaster and brought all the minerals and the salts out of the plaster and sucked it into the stone and then popped it off the inside. So this is an illustration in no matter what technologies we invent today to deal with historic fabric of historic buildings, we often cannot anticipate that we may solve one problem, but we may create another that we didn't anticipate. So that's why there's a shingle roof back on top of the west wing or the east wing of the museum. Because there was a steel roof on, great. Shed the snow right off of that thing and the water right off, wonderful. Really good and easy to maintain. You get a hailstorm, you just replace the metal roof, wonderful. Problem is, the snow comes right off that roof really quickly and piles at the bottom of the walls. What's that building made out of? Mud. What happens with dry mud when it gets wet? It turns into wet mud. Can you have a building made out of wet mud with dry mud on top? Not for long. And so the walls at the bottom of the fort were rotting out from the ground up. And so they put shingles back on, and the shingles act as a baffle, and they kind of keep the snow on, and they kind of help the snow melt and percolate out in ways that break it up a little bit so that not so much snow and moisture sits at the base of the walls. So we tried one restoration, it solved one problem about snow removal and stuff like that, and it made another. So Viollet-le-Duc, good idea. It did probably save the vaults. Filling the building full of water, never a good idea. Buildings and water hate each other, and they always have. So anyway, just to illustrate, that's what that was. So what are they doing about the salts? See all this? See all that damage right there? Like that's the original surface, but then all this lighter stuff is where it's eroded back. These are the webs of the vaults. That's all happened in the past 2 years.
Wow.
It wasn't doing that when the roof was intact, obviously. So what are they doing? They made this plaster, of course. They made this plaster slurry, especially mixed plaster that's fairly inert. And it's a sacrificial layer of plaster. And they are coating every inch of the vaults, which is a lot. Acres and acres and acres of surface. They're coating it with this plaster, and they spray it on, and then plasterers come in and they very precisely smooth it down over every single surface to be within 1/2 centimeter and 1 centimeter, so between 1/3 of an inch and 1/2 inch thick. That's going to sit on there, so the entire interior is kind of white, the vaulting. This sits there on the vaults, and the water migrates out of the stone, but it doesn't pop the stone off. Instead, it gets sucked up. This absorbs the water, this sacrificial layer, and then they scrape this off in a few months. It's a big job. But Jim, you had a question.
Oh, that was, yes. So they actually leave the efflorescence, but when they pull that off, it pulls the efflorescence off.
It should pull the salt and the efflorescence out, yeah. It should. That's what they're hoping.
Are you saying that they're gonna do this to the whole surface?
They're gonna do it to at least the underside of the vaults where lots of the water is
And then
sitting.
they're gonna come and take it all off?
And then they're gonna take it all off. Yeah.
Is that done by sandblasting then?
I would assume not. I assume they're
Yeah, how
gonna
would you
do,
get
I
that
don't
off?
know.
With a dental pit.
Yeah, I mean, it may be a lot of like, just really gentle scraping because sandblasting would
Yeah.
cause a lot of problems. Yeah, so they're doing this like now, like this is still going on like, today in the
It'll
building.
take a year by itself.
Oh yeah, I know. So this is why it's taken 2 years and we still haven't started any of the actual restoration.
And do they know, is this working?
I don't think they quite have that data back yet. They were doing something like this on the cathedral in York on the outside because it kind of kept melting in the rain as well, and they've done a bunch of tests. This kind of they're called sacrificial plaster and sacrificial masonry services has been a big deal for the past 15 or 20 years in masonry studies and conservation studies to try to figure out which mixtures are right for which types of stone and how you work them.
Tony, do you know, is this an international, is this a world team that travels to where these things happen?
It's mostly French.
Really?
But there's a lot of international expertise working here as well. They're drawing craftspeople of all different sorts from all over Europe mainly, but further afield. Like in England, the Masons kind of come over for this project as well and that sort of stuff. So there's probably some American folks here as well. A lot of the folks doing this work are kids like in their 20s. It's an interesting job. So lots of men and women. It's a pretty mixed group. So kind of nice, I guess. This is a medieval frame.
I was gonna say, that looks medieval.
Yeah, this is a medieval frame. It's all hand done from oaks. It's a new one. It's all there's no nails holding it together. It's all pegs, which is better than nails because nails make it more rigid. The pegs. These are built green, so they don't dry. They don't spend a lot of time in a kiln drying this timber out. They build it green. And then when it dries, it twists, but everything twists together. And because if you had parts that were dry and parts that were green, when it twisted, it would explode. And you don't want that. And the evidence is most medieval timber frames were built green. So they need thousands of oaks, and they need oaks that are like 60, 80 feet long and straight. Well, fortunately, kings 200 years ago in France planted a bunch of oak forests for the glory of the French Navy. And the glorious French Navy doesn't need too many oaks anymore, and so they've donated them or sold them to the Notre Dame project. And thousands of oaks have been harvested, but from across France. So it's not like one forest they're decimating. And they're going out and they're looking for the trees the same way they did in the Middle Ages when they did this, in that there's a forester appointed by the government. The forester goes out into the government forest, and they know, and the foresters in the forest know every tree there. And they go, oh, this oak will be a good one. And they trek out to the oak and they look at it, they observe it, they try to figure out how the grain's going to work, what parts they can use for which parts of the building. Some parts they actually need it to bend a little bit, so they look and see, well, is that branch exactly right or not? And then when they do finally find the right ones, they fell them. All the timber for rebuilding the spire is going to be saw cut by mechanical saws, because that's what Viollet-le-Duc did in the 19th century. So they're like, well, we can rebuild that with mechanical saws. Apparently, they're going to build the rest of the roof with hand tools.
Wow.
I'm not sure they're going to stick with that, but they're going to rebuild it with hand tools. And this is an example frame of what it might look like when they're actually out on site. All these frames are built off-site to the measurements they need. They're all put together with pegs, and then every joint is scribed, where they make like, they basically take an iron pointed tool and they draw it across two sides of a joint, and then they usually do it with Roman numerals or symbols, and then you bring the whole frame, you disassemble the whole frame, cart it into Paris, and then on site you bring all the timber up on top of the roofs into your scaffolding, and then you reassemble it there, put the jigsaw puzzle back together, and then hoist it back up with ropes and peg it into the wall plates at the top of the walls.
And they think this.
And this is gonna be ready for the
being ready
Olympics.
for the Olympics?
And we have 2 years to finish this. And they haven't started. They've selected and
No.
cut the timber. That's as far as we've gone.
No, and they better not try to have it ready.
I
Olympics or those
Right,
screw
don't go
things
fast.
up.
I think they should push the Olympics
Go too
back.
fast.
Exactly.
It's happened before.
Move it to somewhere else and
Yeah,
then
give
come
somewhere
back to us in about
We'll
16 years.
We'll come back in,
Yeah.
Yeah.
It only took 100 years to build a building at first, which is pretty quick for a cathedral, so, in a century we'll come back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll get it on the next flip-flop.
The 21, 24 Olympics,
Do it
we'll be
right.
ready.
Do it.
So anyway, so this is just an example frame that they were building as a bit of a publicity stunt. So because they really have not, they cut the timber and that's as far as they've gone today. So, but it's a whole process.
Looks like a huge catapult.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it?
Yeah, it looks like a trebuchet or what do you.
And then to me, one of the exciting things that they've also done is they've done the archaeology. And so this is the crossing where all of the spire and everything fell in the middle of the church. They said, okay, we'll give you 3 weeks, archaeologists, to excavate that. 3 weeks to excavate the center of the most important building in one of the most important cities on earth.
Why did they limit it?
Because they didn't think they'd find much, because they thought Viollet-le-Duc and everybody after the Middle Ages would have destroyed the archaeology under there. And these things, these are concrete heating duct systems,
Oh my.
did destroy most of the archaeology under the buildings.
Oh my God.
But, what about this?
Yeah, what is that?
Oh, what's that?
A coffin.
Yeah, or like a gangster violin case.
Yeah. Only play trombone.
Remember what I said are voussoirs? Those are the bits of the arches of the ribs that collapsed. They went through the floor and landed inside the heating system. Those are a few of the voussoirs.
Wow.
This is some of the original flooring of the cathedral, the underflooring and that sort of stuff. And then they found this guy. So, I'm probably a guy. So yeah, that's a coffin. It's a lead coffin. It's from the 14th century. And it's sitting in a stone coffin. It's a lead coffin inside a stone coffin.
Yeah.
This stone coffin is not this person's lead coffin, or this lead coffin does not belong in that stone coffin. At some point in the past, they found this person, needed to move them, and then just stuck them in somebody else's stone coffin. Which is really, that's why it's got this weird angle. Because if it was in the stone coffin made for it, medieval stone sepulchres are designed around the shape of the lead coffin for that person. And that is absolutely not designed for that person. So that's interesting. At some point in the past, they moved this person. To be buried here in the crossing of Notre Dame in the 14th century, you would be stinking rich. So this is a very wealthy person. We have no idea who it was. They would have had a stone on top of them set into the floor that would have had their name and maybe like like engraved in brass, 14th century, yeah, you might have had a brass. Or it might have just been engraved in the stone surface and it would have had their name and their family name and ora pro nobis, pray for me, pray for us, that sort of thing. So you'd say a prayer for the person as you're kneeling in the crossing during the elevation of the host at Mass. And you'd be kneeling and you would see Christ would be present literally in the building in front of you in the consecrated host that's lifted above. So you're literally present with God. And then underneath you is a person who's gone before you. And so as you look down, you read, Ora pro me, pray for me. So you pray, so the living pray for the dead, and we're all in the presence of God together, and your prayers during the elevation of the host for the person you're kneeling on helps them get a few more days out of purgatory. And it's like this beautiful, like the dead are not gone, like everybody's participating in this single moment. I think it's, I'm not a medieval Roman Catholic, but I think it's a beautiful piece of poetry.
How about DNA?
Pardon?
DNA.
Yeah,
DNA.
I was going to say, are they going to pop it open?
But there was no plaque or anything that.
There was nothing. So
had been on
medieval
the floor,
churches, even like your lowly parish churches in little villages, they are just packed full of bodies. They're just, everybody's buried under the floor or out in the churchyard, and they would just, there's no space, but so and so really wants to be buried next to so and so, so we'll just dig up whoever's there. Throw them in their, we'll take their bones and put them in the charnel house, and then we'll throw their stone out in the churchyard, and then we'll use it for lintels in our next rebuilding project, which happens all the time. We get thousands of medieval tombstones from, when a medieval church burns and falls apart, it's great because then you find out how much reused stonework there was. And you find all these monuments from centuries before.
Wow.
And so that's probably what happened to this guy. The floor in this cathedral was laid and relaid and relayed and relayed over the centuries. Viollet-le-Duc would have leveled the floor and relayed it again. So it was really common. So we've totally lost all that kind of stuff.
Any other bones or bodies or anything?
I thought they would have found dozens. This is the
Yeah.
crossing, really, really important. Other medieval churches, the crossing is really packed. It's prime real estate. This is the only one I've heard of.
Oh.
No, they found 2. I'm sorry, 2 lead coffins, but this is the one that was really sealed up pretty well. I had a project where we opened a lead coffin that was sealed once, but it was Roman, so it was older than this guy. And it's just, it's just
Wow.
bones.
Do
Yeah.
they decompose inside lead coffins? I don't know anything about
Yeah.
decomposition.
So interestingly, yes and no. It depends on how sealed. If they got that coffin pretty well sealed, then what would be inside would either be a pretty well preserved mummy,
Mummy.
or would be something that archaeologists call mushroom soup.
Ew.
Oh.
That's hope for money.
Yeah, or it could be just dust, depending on. And this coffin did have a few holes in it, so they put an endoscope in there. Oh, and they just released the preliminary findings on this on April 14th of this year. So. Yeah, so you may have seen something about this in the news.
Oh, really?
But anyway, so this sarcophagus, here they put an endoscope in to see if what the state of preservation was in the remains, and they said that they found there was a skeleton in there. They just went by the head. There was a skeleton, or a skull at least, in there that still had some skin on it, but it was really thin and tight. So there's quite a lot of decay, but there may be like clothing. And usually in medieval Christian burials, you didn't leave them with grave goods, meaning you didn't like put in things from their life that was important to them. You just put them in because that stuff, that other material stuff had no value. There was no afterlife where you could take it with you. I mean, there was an afterlife, but you couldn't take anything with you. If this is a cleric, if this is a cleric, it would be male, and he would be buried probably with a chalice and a paten, the little plate, so the cup for the blood and the little plate for the host, wine, sorry. That would have been buried. They made burial chalices and patens that were made out of lead that were just gilded with gold, because you didn't want to throw away too much valuable stuff. If this guy was a higher church ecclesiastic, like a bishop, then he probably would have been buried in full regalia with his sapphire ring. Bishops had sapphire and gold rings, and his crozier, the kind of shepherd's hook, carved out of ivory. That might be in there. If it's a member of the nobility, you would have somebody in really fancy clothes and maybe a few rings. It would be in there.
Are they planning to open that thing up?
So the plans are to open that. My archaeology Twitter community is up in arms about this. They're like, no, leave the dead where to respect the dead, which is a weird view. When I was growing up and doing archaeology 20 years ago, we were like, dead bodies, cool, let's look at them. And now it's more like dead bodies, let's respect them. And that's been a massive shift in archaeology. And I understand why you would want to not work with human remains.
But you can still respect them.
Right, so there's a sense that since this is most likely a French person, a Catholic French person, there are Catholic French people who are archaeologists, and as long as they're working with the remains, it will be done respectfully. And then once they've done their analysis of the remains, they'll be reburied in Notre Dame.
Yeah.
And that's probably okay. So I think working with human remains is still good and vital scientific and archaeological and historical work. I think it just needs to be done respectfully, and if it's done in a culture that has a problem with that, then don't do it. I mean, just don't do it. So I agree. But should they open it? I think they should open it. That's controversial, and now I'm on film, so I might get taken down.
We back you.
But anyway, I understand the arguments on both sides. Edward the Confessor, the last Saxon king of England, was buried in a lead coffin in Westminster Abbey in the 11th century, and in the 17th, when did they open him up? 17th, 18th century, when they opened him up, he was still perfectly preserved.
Oh, wow.
And within hours, the body...
Decent bones.
Oh, God.
When did they do this?
17th, 18th century?
Because they didn't
They would open up the tombs of like royalty in Westminster Abbey. It's not a cathedral, but in Westminster Abbey, they would open those tombs up really regularly to paying tourists, and you could what was it? Which queen? I can't remember which queen was buried there. And Pepys, Samuel Pepys, Pepys' diary. 17th century. He talks about going down to the abbey and kissing Queen so-and-so, and they just open the coffin and he kisses her.
Oh,
Anyway, different attitudes towards the dead. Yeah. And then the other thing they found, and I'm much more excited about this, they found in the rubble under the crossing, they found this and other fragments. This is a piece of the rood screen. Rood is spelled R-O-O-D, not R-U-D-E. Rood means, it's an Old English term for cross. The rood screen in a medieval cathedral was not like a screen door that you can really see through. It was a wall, and it was usually set up in the crossing of the church in front of the chancel and choir where the high altar and the clergy were. It was like a wall that separated the kind of clergy and the people. And then the wall was highly, well, this is Romanesque, so this is sort of 12th century carving, maybe late 11th. This looks late 12th to me, but I don't know what I'm talking about, maybe. I don't know, the beadwork looks mid-12th, I don't know. But that looks like 13th. Anyway, they'd be highly sculpted solid stone screens and sculpted with usually scenes of the life of Christ.
Stone?
Stone, yeah. And they found the original Romanesque rood screen from Notre Dame, pieces of it, the original Romanesque rood screen from Notre Dame, as building rubble in the crossing of the cathedral.
Oh my God.
So remember I was telling you that they would just pick up any old thing if they needed to move it and redo it, and then what do you do with a bunch of old stone? Like sculpted stone's no good for building with
That's what
because
this is that we're looking at?
Yeah.
This is rubble that was found?
this is building rubble, yeah. Sculpted stone's no good for building with because it's all sculpted, it's irregular. So either if it was big enough, they'd pare off and shave off the back and the sides and then turn it around so the sculpting part was facing the inside of the wall and put it in the wall, and you'd never know until the building collapsed and then the archaeologists would find it again. This was in the floor.
Wow.
So the floor fill from the Romanesque building because they had a beautiful Gothic screen in there. And so when they had this really beautiful fancy screen that was in the latest style, and this thing had been sitting around for 200 or 300 years, they're like, oh, get rid of that old thing. And they just broke it into pieces and then used it as building rubble in their next project.
What will a separate museum or something be set up for pieces
Yeah, this
like
is going.
this?
Yeah, this is going. They have a few other, like 2 or 3 other pieces. They knew there was a Romanesque sculpted screen, but they found a bunch more. So they're really excited. So anyway, and on top of this, the screen would have been huge. It would have covered the full width of the nave of the building at the crossing, or maybe just east of the crossing. And then it would have been really tall, 12, 15 feet tall, and on top of that would have been a huge crucifix. And that's why the rood, the cross, the rood screen.
It's too bad Robin left, because Robin makes beautiful chunky jewelry just like that.
Yeah, and then look at that beautiful, look at that beautiful thing there. Yeah, I think it's stunning. And this is a king. This is a scepter. So it's a picture of a king.
Yeah, it's Celtic.
Are we seeing
Pigment?
paint? Yeah,
Yeah.
pigment?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, it's cool. It's really cool.
Yeah,
So anyway, but the face is bashed off.
yeah.
And this arm is bashed off. So yeah, and we can see that this is the edge of a panel. And if this is in the ground, this is in the ground. If this is a piece that's taken out of the ground and I don't have context for it, this will be the edge of the panel, and they'll be like comic book panels of bas relief. But this may actually just be a pipe in the ground. I don't know what this is on the side.
Oh, I see.
So that's a
Yeah.
broken off edge of it.
Yeah.
So anyway, I was really excited by this because it's a piece of Romanesque art that came out of Notre Dame. There's not much of the Romanesque Notre Dame left, so that's cool. What's next? The glass. 13th century glass. It's famous for the 13th century, the 3 big rose windows, the north, the south, and the west rose. 13th century, beautiful stuff like this. Very little of this is 13th century. So this is the first time they've really had a chance to examine the glass, because the scaffolding's everywhere, so you can just walk right up to it. I did this at York Minster. They have a 15th century medieval glass window at the East End that's the size of a tennis court. It's the biggest medieval glass in England. It's from 1406. I love it. It shows the whole history of creation from beginning to end. And I've only seen it, I usually only saw it from the floor, but they were put scaffolding up and doing a restoration project. And just one day, one of my students came into the office and said, it was a really quiet day, he's like, you want to go up the window? Yeah. So we went up the window and I was nose to nose with this glass that I could only see from like 300-400 feet away. I'm nose to nose with these panels of glass. So being nose to nose with this is glorious.
I guess it's got to be just magnificent up close.
Yeah, no, it's because from the floor, I mean, you're looking at something that's 80, 100 feet up in the air. And from the floor, it's just beautiful blue and
Colors,
bits of
yeah.
yellow.
Yeah.
And you can kind of tell that you would have Christ in the middle and maybe the apostles around the edge and then the saints around the edge. You would maybe have that, but and they know what it's like because they've been up close before. There's walkways and stuff that go underneath. You know, people have studied these windows for centuries, but people really haven't gotten up close to this in the last 150 years. Stained glass windows continually decay, and so you're always having to replace little panes of glass, whole panels of glass, and you're having to replace the lead decays that sticks them together. Medieval glass, especially 13th century medieval glass, was built with a formula of sand and potash and that sort of stuff in it. And if you put in potash, it lowers the melting point of the sand so that you can make the glass with a cooler fire and a cooler furnace, which means you're using less fuel. It's cheaper glass. By the way, this really stunning blue color, do you know where they get this from? This is so cool. There was a stained glass center in York, and they were doing a chemical analysis of 13th century stained glass, and they realized that the blue is from Roman floor mosaic tesserae, so a mosaic and the little pieces of stone and glass, blue glass. They used to put blue glass in their mosaics, and not all, but a lot of this blue glass turns out that comes from France is recycled Roman tesserae that have been kind of melted down and mixed into the
Oh my
pot.
goodness.
Yeah, I don't know if that's 100% what they've done here, but it's just kind of cool to see how they're recycling stuff. But anyway, so this beautiful 13th century glass, turns out Viollet-le-Duc rebuilt most of this. Because you can really, when you get your nose up close, you can tell what's medieval glass and what's later glass. Because they have different chemical compositions. The medieval glass had too much potash in it to lower the temperature of firing. And potash corrodes when it's exposed to air. So the glass gets really dark because it's basically rusting. And so the darker bits, like that chunk right there, is probably medieval. That bit of yellow green is probably medieval. That bit's modern. All of this, that's modern. That's modern. That might be medieval. Anyway, so you can just go and look at the glass and you can figure out its relative age. So they have some glaziers and some restorers up there looking at every single piece of the glass, drawing it, coloring it, and mapping it out. And they realized that this whole window, two things happen to this window. One is that most of this is replaced. Now, whether it's replacing the same pattern and colors that were there, they don't know, but Le Duc sees these scenes right here. They're actually like narrative scenes from scripture and saints' lives. Some of them, I'm not sure, some of them are missing their toes, and some of them are missing more. And that's because these panels of glass come from somewhere else and they've been cut down to fit in this size. I don't know the full story. This looks very 12th century to me. It wasn't uncommon to take glass from a 12th century cathedral, and when you rebuilt your cathedral in the 13th century, you move the glass and you cut it down to fit the shapes of the windows.
Are they keeping count?
Yeah.
Numbers, pieces of glass?
Oh yeah, everything is absolutely meticulously accounted for, and it doesn't matter how old the glass was. Everything is absolutely meticulously. Yeah, it's a pretty amazing process.
Wow.
Every one of these has a number. Every panel has a number and a letter, and so that you could look at, even if these got jumbled up, you could look in at a key and basically unjumble them. That sort
We
of
must be very grateful for computers.
Yeah. Although most of this is done by hand. They get up there. They get up there with a box. Yeah. But they get up there with a box of crayons, and they have a black and white drawing of each panel, and then they color it in to denote ages of glass and stuff like that.
Tony, was a window like this designed by one person or a team, or was it made up as they went
It
along?
was very often one person.
Wow.
Yeah, and then with a huge team, like a huge work team, and then often the thematic design of the window was done in collaboration with whoever's paying for it. So.
And how many were lost?
How many were lost?
Of fallen?
Almost none. The 18th and 19th century clergy at Notre Cathedral removed and threw away the stained glass, many of the stained glass windows that were lower to the ground because they were too dark. They wanted more light in the building. So those are gone. But these ones that were higher up were saved.
Were any of the stained glass windows lost in the fire?
No, this is an amazing thing.
Yeah.
None of the windows were lost. None, which is this miracle, and they weren't even, it didn't get hot enough,
You'd think
close enough to
that's
that it cracked it.
You'd think the
Right.
heat would have.
Right.
Yeah. So when York Minster, the cathedral I grew up next to, lived next to, when its south transept burned, it had a rose window in it too. And the whole roof burned off because it was a wood roof. The vaults were wood, not stone. The whole thing burned off, which means that the fire got right up against the rose
Which
window.
fire was this?
1984, there was a fire
Oh,
at York
okay.
Minster, and it burned the whole roof off on the south transept, and it got right up against the rose window in the south transept. And all that glass just it stayed in place, and the lead did not melt out of it, but it stayed in place, but it's what they call crazed. It just shattered into tiny little fragments, and they had to stick it all back together again with epoxy and
But the lead didn't melt?
but the lead did not melt, it stayed put. It was not that hot, but it was still hot enough in there that it crazed the glass. And that was 15th, 16th century glass. 13th century glass is thicker.
Well, you'd think that's what would have happened here.
You would think, but the fire did not, it never got it didn't get inside the building. It was only on the vaults above. Those vaults saved it. If it got inside the building, we might have lost everything. But anyway, they also discovered, maybe not this window, but one of the windows, Viollet-le-Duc dismantled all the stone. The stonework is called tracery. He dismantled all of the tracery and rotated the whole wheel of the window 15 degrees. And then put it back in again, and then rebuilt all of the stained glass so that the stained glass wasn't 15 degrees off. It was rotated, so there's so much glass that's in Viollet-le-Duc.
But tell us why.
Why?
Yeah,
Why did he
change
do
it
it?
15 degrees.
Because, so I don't think it was this window, because the arms of this window, what he did is he rotated 15 degrees so that you had arms that were straight up and down to provide some structural strength to that gable. He thought it would make it stronger, so he rotated the whole thing 15 degrees so that you had at least one straight up and down set of arms in your wheel window. And then that required all the glass to be reshaped 15 degrees. Anyway, I think it's amazing what you find, and they didn't know that until the fire.
They didn't know CD that many.
Yeah. So yeah, look at that.
Beautiful.
There's the vaults. There's so much sunlight inside, because my impressions of Notre Dame from when I was in there is dark. And it's gloriously bright.
Skylight now.
Yeah, exactly. That beautiful skylight. So this is the western window. Here's the organ. The great organ survived as well, which is amazing. But it suffered. It got completely full of all its pipes got completely full of lead and water. So they dismantled the whole thing. Great organ, 17th century. Oh man, I'm so bad on my centuries right now, this presentation. Look all this up. But the great organ, they dismantled completely and took it to a specialist workshop in France, and they're rebuilding the whole thing. They're going to put it back together, and it's going to take ages to retune it as it settles back into its home and as it settles. Because cathedral organs, the cathedral itself is an instrument, is a musical instrument. And when you play the organ, you're kind of driving the whole cathedral. And the organ is tuned to the space, which will get us to another bit of the restoration work. But anyway, I just thought this was really good to show you what's left to do. They've still got to work on the glass. There's a ton of work to do on the glass. They've still got to rebuild the organ. They lost 2 organs already. There were organs in the choir, and that all burned off. And then they've got to restore the vaults. Nobody's talking about the vaults yet. And all of my sort of research and preparation for this, we hear everybody talking about the timber of the roof, the lead of the roof, how we're going to rebuild the spire, what are we going to do about the glass, what are we going to do about the organ. Nobody's talking about how they're going to rebuild the masonry of the ceiling of the vaults. They're going to do it the old-fashioned way, they're going to do it the medieval way, but it's going to be so much work. And that'll be the last thing they do, because they got to get a roof on it first, so that then they can rebuild the vaults without getting them soaked with water as they build. So,
Are you sure $1 billion's enough?
exactly.
No.
Nobody knows how much it is to,
No.
how much it actually costs to build a French cathedral. We know how much it cost in the Middle Ages, but the equivalent of $1 billion? Sure,
Yeah.
sure. So yeah, so it's a fascinating conundrum. So the vaults. Okay, what happens when you're building the vaults and you're thinking about tuning an organ to the space? Notre Dame Cathedral sounded like no other cathedral on earth. No cathedral sounds like any other cathedral on earth. Every cathedral is its own instrument. So when you rebuild a building, you got to rebuild its acoustic. You got to. So we think about a building being stuff you can touch, stuff that can burn, stuff that you can lose or you can improve. You don't ever think about the intangible heritage which would be things that you can't touch, things that are fleeting. And one of those things is sound. And Notre Dame sounds absolutely nothing now. Notre Dame, with all those holes in the ceiling and the roof off, and all the water in the walls and all the scaffolding up, sounds nothing like Notre Dame did 3-4 years ago, right? And when the rebuilding is rebuilt and all that stuff's removed, it will still probably be forever altered. It's like rebuilding part of a violin. It will never be the same tone.
Quite the same.
Quite the same. I mean, the untrained ear will be fine, but I think some people will be rather sensitive to it. So they're doing a lot of research on how they can restore the acoustic. The building was completely digitally mapped using laser scanning several times just a few years before it was burned. So they've got a really good geometric model of the building that they can work off of. And there's acoustic software that you can use where you've handed a 3D model of a building, and then you say, let's say I'm standing right here, and I'm emitting a sound. Let's watch sound propagate through the space, and we can see how that kind of moves. And so they're going to take their 3D model from the laser scans of the cathedral before it burned, and they're going to run a bunch of acoustic tests. And then they're going to run that against the proposed reconstruction. And they're thinking about not just the shape of the building, but the materials it's made out of. And they're going to try as best they can to come up with an acoustic reconstruction of the building when they reconstruct those vaults. And this is just an example. This is not Notre Dame. This is another building somewhere else. But the research team working on the audio of the building, this is something they would be looking at, a model. And local connection, I'm working with members of this team. So one of my archaeological specialties was archaeoacoustics of churches. And in York, at the university there, they also have a known specialism in archaeoacoustics. There was an issue of Science News about 1.5 years ago that talked about the acoustic reconstruction, and some of the people I work with at York, I still work with them sometimes, they're working on this project along with a couple of French leads. And they're modeling the space right now, and I was just contacted about a month ago by them, and they said, do you remember when we worked on this project together? This is not Notre Dame, this is England. So we're not, boom, we're completely not in Notre Dame anymore. This is a building, this is a rood screen, yes, right, this is a timber one, and it's a 14th, 15th century one, but this is a rood screen, big crucifix, sculptures, a couple of altars, and then the high altar in the distance. This is not Notre Dame, this is not anything like what Notre Dame looked like in the past. This is the King's private chapel in the Palace of Westminster. This chamber became the first House of Commons in the 16th century. I worked on it, and now it burned, and it's gone. It's now the entryway to Parliament in England, in London.
It burned when?
It burned in 1834. But anyway, in the Middle Ages, we have lots of
I didn't know they had
evidence.
photography back then.
Yeah, they do. You just have to build a time machine and bring your camera.
Yeah.
In the 14th, we have enough evidence that we have a really good guess of what it looked like in the 14th century. This is my reconstruction of that. I worked with, so I made, this is a 3D model in computer, and I made this 3D model back when I had a different job. And, but I worked with a huge team of researchers from all over Europe working on this project. So like these statues, those guys right there, those apostles, those are actually from Cologne Cathedral, for example. He's Spanish. Those are French. Anyway, these little guys are from Westminster. But I worked with a big team, and we rebuilt this space virtually. And then the acoustics team we worked with rebuilt this space as it looked when it was the first House of Commons. So you could basically sit in the House of Commons and listen to Pitt the Younger give a speech and what it would have sounded like. Which is really cool because this building does not exist anymore. You could not go in there and dress up as Pitt the Younger and give a speech, or as Pitt the Elder, one of the Pitts. You couldn't do that. Or Disraeli or something like that. No, Disraeli's after this. But anyway, so they did it for the House of Commons chamber, and then they just got in touch with me and said, well, we're doing all this work on Notre Dame, and they're really interested in church acoustics of the Sainte-Chapelle, and this was the English king's answer to the Sainte-Chapelle. And so we really want to know about the acoustics of that, because we're interested in how acoustics perform in these high medieval Gothic churches. Can you please build us the acoustic model of this so we can run it? So the same team that's doing Notre Dame is going to, I have to finish building the acoustic version of this model. And then they're going to use that to run the acoustics as well. So there's a tiny little connection to the Notre.
You're gonna make
No,
Veta famous.
there's a tiny little, it's like a sideways, it's like third cousins twice removed sort of thing, but it is a connection.
By marriage.
And we know you.
That's right. If I finish the
6
model.
degrees of.
That's right. So what needs to be redone? Vaults need to be redone. The acoustics need to be redone. You need to rebuild. This is the timbers, the forest before it burned.
Now, acoustically, though, you've already stated that the forest, when it was initially constructed, was with green timber.
Mm-hmm.
But then
It dries
acoustics would dry,
Yeah.
so acoustically, it
It has matured.
ages.
It has matured
Right,
over 800
Right,
years. yeah.
and so even then, you have no control over that, the fact that green timber is going in and stone is being used that is newly quarried.
Yeah, yeah.
And so as a result, it will develop its
Well,
own
and this has to
new
be a
character.
major portion of it, because that's basically a sound box.
It's a sound box. To what extent that plays, because you have these stone vaults, that are between that thick and that thick, and then you've got the timber work behind that, but it's got to have an effect.
Space is a
Yeah.
sound box.
Yeah. So to what extent the timber plays into the sound of the cathedral because it's behind the vaults, I don't know.
Yeah.
But that's the team's working on that. So yeah, and to what extent you're ever going to be able to modeling acoustics is notoriously difficult. Like they tried modeling the acoustics in the Albert Hall, and then it still was a terrible place to perform, right? Even though they went all the money for that. So it's notoriously difficult, but they thought they'd try anyway. So yeah, so they got to rebuild that, and then of course they got to rebuild this guy. They got to rebuild the spire, and they're going to rebuild it in lead in timber-coated lead. So there's the original, the Viollet-le-Duc from 1859. Here's his model of it, his little timber model of it, and that's the picture of it being built at the time. Those are some big timbers on that scaffold.
Yeah.
I mean, if you consider that, those are like 60-foot timbers. I mean, that's amazing. The amount of scaffolding timber work they have.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, Tony, didn't they have a contest of what the new spire should look? Did
They
they
did.
ever decide on something? Did they go back and say, we're gonna do it the way Leduc?
The authorities said we're going to
We're gonna redo-
reconstruct Leduc's.
Good.
That's been decided?
Yep.
Good, because some of those were, gosh, awful.
I know,
The idea
they
was-
were, I know, bizarre.
The idea was that this was that this is like iconically part of France's heritage and
Yeah.
identity. But the other argument, I would have loved them to have built something kooky on top of this. I think it would have been great to have a difference. Because I made the argument 3 years ago, and I still stand by my argument that this building has been built and rebuilt and added to and collapsed and burned and rebuilt time and time again over 800 years. There is no original Notre Dame. It's a living structure. And if you preserve it, fossilize it, if you try to just rebuild exactly what was there, to me it ceases to be alive. To me it's got to keep
It
changing
can't
a
be
little bit.
static, it has to be.
It's got to change a little bit. So what a great opportunity to continue the life of this building. But what if you stick a beautiful, what if you stick a swimming pool on the roof, like some people wanted to do? Or what if you stick a beautiful glass and steel and aluminum greenhouse structure on the roof, or a big laser beam of light, or a Gaudi thing? What happens if you do that? It looks really cool now, but in 50 years, do you suddenly find that these walls are buckling? In 50 years, do you find that the stone is melting at a rapid rate under there? In 50 years, do you realize that it's lost any of its its je ne sais quoi, its spirit from the inside? Like when you walk into the building, suddenly it feels like an airport terminal. How much are you what's gonna happen that you can't anticipate? So rebuilding it using the traditional techniques with the traditional materials is, from a conservation point of view, the best way to do it, because it will then settle in and age the way it was always in. These buildings are dynamic systems, meant to work in a certain way, and if you introduce foreign parts into that system, you
That
may
weren't
break the whole
available.
system apart.
That,
That weren't available.
Yeah.
And you just don't know, and we've seen it so many times in other buildings where they've taken shortcuts. Even like, you need to repoint the stonework in the mercantile, so instead of using a lime mortar, you're like, I'll just use some Portland cement, right? Because it's cheap, it's the same stuff, it's meant to keep stone together, and then you find in 20 years there's no stone left in that building because it's all rotted out, and all you have is a matrix of Portland cement, right?
Yeah.
You see that time and time again in stone buildings across the world. You really do need to use lime mortar. So I can see why you would rebuild it using the same tools and materials as before, because that's probably what this system needs to continue to function. So I understand. This, if Leduc had not built this spire on here, we would probably still have the crossing vaults. So that's a foreign introduction to the building, although there was a medieval spire, but it only went up about here. You know, so, you know, what are you going to choose to rebuild and how are you going to rebuild it? But they said, we're going to go back to the originals. I totally respect that from a buildings conservation point of view, but I really wish they put a big laser beam on it or something. So, that's all I've got to talk to you about. It's 2 hours. Thank you for sticking
Oh,
with
it
it,
was
everybody.
fabulous.
with the introduction of the water to extinguish the fire, and the added weight, has the foundation settled even more? Again, it's on an island, and so, having said that, it's on mud, you know.
I don't know. It did not come up, it hasn't come up in any of the stuff I've been watching. So if there are real concerns about that moving, it hasn't percolated to the surface of, to the top level of what people are really talking about the building. So my suspicion is they're watching that extremely closely, but they've not noticed anything yet. I mean, it could be the sort of thing that could take decades before you start to notice settling.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, they need to see what's under the mud, under the
yeah,
geology.
yeah. Yeah, like how far down? I mean, in this building, is it built on ruins? They used to build a lot of these old buildings on top of Roman sites. Building buildings on ruins is a bad idea because those settle terribly. But I mean,
Unevenly.
yeah, really unevenly in 800. But I mean, the bulk of the building's been standing for 800 years. It has settled in some places and not others. So to what extent, like, if you look at the porch of my house on Main Street here, and you look at it, and the whole house is leaning north because that's downhill. And the northmost pillar's doing this thing. It's been doing this kind of crooked dance for decades. And all of the cracks and plaster work in my house have been there for decades. So my house settled down and it's not moving anymore. So it's not in danger. I think because they're not noticing any changes in the settlement of the building now, I think they think that whatever settlement has occurred is pretty stable now. But they're still watching it. All of these buildings they watch. You'll even see it in buildings in Colorado and America. If you're looking at a stone building, sometimes on the walls of the building you'll notice little things that look like microscope slides, and they'll be like glued to the walls of the building. Those are called telltales. And if they're worried about a part of the masonry building, if they're worried about a part of the masonry building moving, they basically glue these glass microscope slides across a crack. And if that crack grows, it'll break the slide. And if the slide's broken, and then all you do is that you do a normal inspection. If you're worried about it moving, you do a monthly inspection or a weekly, but usually a yearly inspection, sometimes a 5-year inspection. And you notice how many telltales you've broken in that time. And if you break more telltales than you're comfortable with, you know the building's moving, and you know how fast it's moving and what you need to do. Yeah. So at York, for example, it has this enormous central tower, and in the 60s, they were breaking telltales at like several a week. And they knew that tower was going to collapse. And it had collapsed once in the late 14th century already. So they knew, and it's because it's built on top of the Roman headquarters for the Roman city of York, where Constantine the Great was declared emperor of Rome. And it was built right there, right where he was declared. And there's this beautiful Roman complex underneath it that's got full of all sorts of rooms and things, and is just settling differentially. And that tower is this huge masonry tower, and it was a Romanesque tower that then got a massive 15th century tower put on top of it, and those Romanesque piers were not up to the job after 800-900 years. And they just started to settle, and they were breaking telltales all over the place. Like in a week, they'd break like 5 or 6. And they'd be like, we're gonna lose this building within months. Like a whole building, we gotta do something. And that's when they excavated the entire minster, and then they put concrete around the bases of the main pillars for the crossing, and then they put metal straps into it to tie everything back together. And then they tied the tower with metal.
And that's fascinating to think of this, how they determine what the solution would be for stabilizing
Yeah.
something.
It's super cool. It's really cool. And then they hid it all from view, which is really neat. And so if this building starts moving, they'll do something similar there. There's a cool story in the 18th century. Veta Cathedral in France, if you know about that, it's the tallest medieval cathedral built. And they only built the eastern half of it, and then they stopped because it kept falling apart. Like it's crazy high, and it's like eggshell thin all the way up. And it was just moving all over the place. They put more flying buttresses up against it, and it kept moving. And into the 18th century, it kept moving, and they knew it was going to come down. And in the 18th century, they came up with this really cool way to save it, because they knew it was coming down from the roof. And so the stonework around the top, they surrounded by a steel band of metal, and then they superheated it, and then they let it shrink, and it drew the whole building together after it cooled. Super cool. I don't know how they superheated it without burning the whole building down, but they put it around there as tight as they could, and then they superheated it, and then let it cool, and it shrank, and it sucked the whole building
Brought it
together.
right back to center.
It's super cool. And that was like 18th century.
Yeah.
Jim?
I had a question about that as far as the fire, any steel, any iron in the building?
Yeah, thank you so much, because I mentioned that. When the archaeologists went in and excavated the site after the destruction of it, because the roof was off the wall tops, they found in the wall tops cramps. You know what cramps are? Or staples? They're these big iron staples. They're like this long, and they're like this big around, and they were stapling the top, two per joint of stones all around the tops of the walls on the east end of the cathedral, and they found dozens and dozens of them. They never knew they were there, and they never knew they built with them. So they've done radar surveys of the ground-penetrating radar of the and other sonic surveys of the walls of the whole building, and they're finding a lot of iron actually in the walls, which they never ever would have found. And they did some work on the wall tops. They removed a few of the wall tops, because the timber was sitting on top of it. They never ever knew it was even there. The timber was gone, and so they removed a few of them, and they did work on it. And what they're able to trace where the iron came from that they built it with, because when you forge iron, it picks up certain local resonances and frequencies magnetically and also thermoluminescently. No, pottery does thermoluminescence. Iron does another sort. Anyway, so it picks up the signature of where it's from, and they're able to track it. And they were discovering that the sources for this ironwork have come from all over France, just all over France. And that they did the microscopy of it. They do like a thin section through the piece, and then they polish it, and you look at it in a microscope, and you find it's made out of layers and layers and layers. And that these layers, each layer is like a completely different iron from a completely different place. And it's because it's recycled iron. They were buying junk iron, and then they were recycling it, reforging it into these staples, which it wasn't going to be decorative. It needed to staple together the stones at the top of the walls. And so we have like this junk shop of France that was recycled into the top of the cathedral. Who knows if more cathedrals have it? I mean, we have to burn a few more down, and we'll find out.
So,
Get busy.
would the heating of the iron in the fire because it's gonna change at a different rate and expand, wouldn't it have popped stone and stuff like that?
Yeah, you would think so, and maybe that happened. It doesn't seem to have happened that much. I think maybe it would have popped it locally, just around where the iron was, but not necessarily popped whole things apart. There's not that much. I mean, they found dozens and dozens of these in the tops of the walls, but it's not a lot. And maybe there's a whole research question there about whether the ironwork that is included in the walls actually makes any real contribution to the structural stability. In the Middle Ages, they knew what they were doing when they were building, because they did these buildings for centuries, so they knew what they were doing. They had a big tradition behind it. They could really do some neat, innovative things. But also sometimes they tended to follow Vitruvius, who was a Roman architect and builder, and his treatise on architecture, his 10 books on architecture, survived into the Middle Ages and were read. Were they read by your average everyday, like, cathedral jobbing mason? Maybe not, but your master mason would have known about them. And they tended to cherry pick things out of Vitruvius and build them into their buildings, but not in an effective way. So the most well-known issue of this is that Vitruvius talks about when you're building a stadium and you have wooden seats, or seats that have wooden tops but maybe sitting on stone, there's space under the seats, and you put jars, clay jars in. And the jars are built to certain sizes, they're tuned, and these are called acoustic jars. And in a classical Greek or a Roman amphitheater or a theater, you would put these jars in under the seats, and it would improve the auditory experience of the space. And so Vitruvius recommends putting these jars in. They have to be freestanding, and they have to be tuned to your space. And he talks about how to do that. And there are many, many, many instances where there are Vitruvian acoustic jars put into medieval churches. But they're all embedded in the walls where they do zero work. And they're not tuned. They're like just household pots. So to what extent was the mason being like, I have read Vitruvius.
Oh, yeah.
In Latin. And in Vitruvius' 9th book, he speaks about these jars. And we know that people sing in churches. So Mr. Patron, who's paying me a lot of money, pay me more and I will include this amazing classical technology into your space, and your choristers will sing better than your neighbors' choristers, and you will be the better cleric. Oh, well, yes, of course, here's a few thousand more pounds, or francs, or whatever. And they had no way of evaluating it. And there's a diary written by a monk in an abbey in the 15th century in France. And he says, the abbages paid a lot of money to have these jars put in under the stalls. The building sounds worse now. So there's no knowing what, they had no way of actually measuring the effect of these things. So these kind of cramps or these staples that were put in the wall tops, to what extent they're actually performing structurally, to what extent was that structural performance understood by the masons who were putting them in, that's a really interesting PhD for someone to do, or research.
So an interesting thing, I was sitting here thinking, all the PhDs that have come out of Notre Dame.
Yeah.
But then I came to you. Did you get your doctorate from New York?
I did, yeah, and many years before this. Mine
Well,
was
no,
2006,
I know,
but yeah.
Still,
But from New York, yeah.
But I keep thinking of all the sound, stone, glass, whatever.
Yeah.
These people are,
Yeah, it's great.
PhDs come out and they're like.
Yeah, there's a lot of silver linings from this disaster.
One other question. If you, as a doctor with this background, if you wanted to, could you go over and visit?
Certainly, yeah. I could get in touch with the scholars on the site and say I have a research question that I would like to pursue here. May I book a time in? And I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's not just because I'm doctor. You know, if any of you can do it, you would just need to propose a research topic that could reasonably be helped by a visit to the site or by working with some of the materials. So, you know, I think it helps if you show a record of publication or interest in whatever field you're pursuing. But yeah, it's open. They want people to study these spaces and these places. So come up with a big research question and go chat to them.
I've got
They're all on Twitter or online. It was just first and then.
Okay, what's your guess about how long this is going to take to finish?
I think they will have it open by the Olympics. I think they will have it finished within 20 years.
Yeah.
20 years, yeah.
No, that's quick.
I think it is really quick.
It took 800 years to do it for.
I just think there's going to be a lot of details, and then there's going to be a lot of things that in 10 years' time they'll go, ooh, that didn't work, we're going to need to fix that. So I think the process is going to be an iterative process where they're going to try something, and then a few years later they're going to be like, we shouldn't have done that, or we need to do something different. But I bet they'll have it open, but it may be token open. Like Macron may stand in there and go, look, we finished! And they'll be like, cameras don't look anywhere other than right here.
Yeah, right.
You know.
Tony, what were those staples that held that were on top of the walls?
Mhm.
How were they I mean, were they were holes drilled that they were set down in, or
So they drilled holes into the stones.
into the stone?
They set them in and then they pour
Okay.
molten lead around the holes.
Oh, okay.
No
Okay.
wiggle.
And that wouldn't crack the stone. I imagine if they cracked a stone when they were doing that kind of heating, if they cracked a stone, they just pull the stone out and put a new
Just
one
put a
in.
new stone in.
Yeah.
They had plenty.
They did. Although getting a stone to the very top of the wall.
Yeah.
There's a reason often that the stones at the top of the wall are smaller than the ones at the bottom. Yeah. If you're a person
They got
carrying
a little
those stones up the scaffolding,
Pulling systems.
yeah.
I know, let's send the new guy.
Interestingly, in medieval Europe, to be a basic jobbing waller would be a class of mason that just built walls, and they were kind of the least paid. They were the lowest paid, and because you just stack stones on top of each other according to whatever the local foreman told you to do. There's a significant proportion, not a majority, but a well-known minority of those workers were women.
Interesting.
So it was a legitimate source of employment for women in medieval Europe. To put big old stones on baskets that you carried on your back and the strap was like around your
These were
forehead.
not your normal women.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
right?
you trundle up the scaffold. They also had cranes, so they would crane up whole pallets of stone. When you got up that high, you crane up pallets, and then you have the women and men carry them along the wall tops to wherever you need to put them.
That's how you got that blood in there.
Yeah, well,
A
yeah.
few here, a few off the sides,
but
you
a
know, and
few
stuff,
people
and
in the
it's
walls.
like,
You
yeah.
can sure see why you would pick it as a field of study.
God,
It's cool.
It's fabulous.
It's really fun. It's cool
Thank you
stuff.
so much.
Yeah, wait, thank you.
Just
yeah.
great.
Thank you, everybody. Maybe 3 more years to do it again.
We'll all go to the Olympics.
That's right. Let's
Well,
all
I'll
go to the
go
Olympics
to see Notre Dame in person.
Thank you, Tony.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
By the time they get it.